Hello, everyone. So, this lecture is just to help you set up to watching the film MissRepresentation, which you're doing your first part of your assignment on. So, this will hopefully give you a bit of context of the film and a way for you to then use it in writing the first part of your assignment. A big part of misrepresentation is around reading and viewing critically. So, by that, what I'm talking about is being critical about what we see. And by see, I mean what we see in the media. So, there are a lot of obviously sexually explicit images of women in the media, as is what misrepresentation is going to go into way more detail about. But you cannot walk outside your door without seeing something sexually explicit, most of the time directed towards women, meaning women being sexually explicit, sexually objectified, to the point of like almost ridiculousness. Like, for example, this Elmer's glue ad, which I don't think that's how you're supposed to use glue. Anyways, to something to the point of like, does that need to be sexualized? But it's also really important that it's not only stuff that's like very explicitly in your face, but also things that are a little bit more subtle. So, a lot of the things that we don't see, or things that are missing from representation. So, for example, this was an ad that came out a couple years ago, but basically they took little girls and dressed them as adult women. And it did create a bit of a scandal. You know, people were really horrified. But at the same time, many feminist theorists said, well, yeah, these are obviously terrible images of, sexually explicit, making a lot of sort of innuendos to young girls. But we live in a culture where that is so common anyways, sexually objectifying women, that, is it that far from the norm? This gets into how so much around sex and sexuality has a gendered narrative to it. I really like this quote by Jessica Valentini, where she says, "What's the difference between venerating women for being fuckable and putting them on a purity pedestal? In both cases, women's worth is contingent upon their ability to please men and to shape their sexual identities around what men want." So whether you are the virgin, pure, chaste person, or the sexually available, whore, so forth, all of them are still surrounded around men's desires and wants, and nothing about what that woman, regardless if she's classified as a virgin or a whore, actually wants. So, what that gets to is that how we talk about sex and or sexuality is gendered. It's very gendered. Even the way that we think about people's sexual agency. A question that I would often ask in classes, and I think I've already asked this to you in class already, when you thought about in high school, who was always called a slut, right? And it was always directed towards women for the most part. And even if there were some men in the school that were called slut, it was not in the same context or in the same tone or had the same implications, right? So there you have it. Just the term slut has very different gendered meanings depending upon who it is applied to. And what feminist theorists around media talk about is that so much around women's and girls' bodies and their sexuality, their sexual agency, their ability to decide what they want to do with their bodies, essentially, are framed oftentimes in the context of what men want, male desire, sexual needs, and so forth. And while these gender scripts and the regulation around women's bodies do oftentimes favor men, they also do a disservice to men. And it gets to the heart of why and how women are sexually objectified. So, for those of you who are not familiar with the term, Sexual objectification is the process of representing or treating a person like a sex object, one that serves another sexual pleasure. So, not even their own sexual pleasure, like they don't feel anything. An object does not feel anything, but instead is used in the service of another for another person. Media, particularly advertisements, are great examples of this. Now, I've already talked a little bit about advertisements in previous class, but I want to talk about it more, especially since misrepresentation goes in much more detail around media, particularly advertisements. Because again, advertisements, advertising in general, they're not going to create an ad that's not going to get you to buy the product. Because what would be the point? That would be wasting money. And if you look around you, there are so many ads, a huge majority of ads that have a, a script to them, or at least some meanings behind them. And they're oftentimes very gendered and very sexual, oftentimes referring towards women, to the point of like, you're not even seeing parts of women. You see their hands, or you see a gesture to what would be women's breasts, but they're actually hamburgers. But we all know what they're referencing. Of course, it can become even much more explicit, where you have women literally just being a display rack. Just literally that their bodies are used for to sell anything, but then also use as furniture, as if that person who's standing there, with shoes on her back, I'm sure that's very comfortable for her. To, incredible sexual innuendos, like it will blow your mind away. To, some very explicit references to male dominance, even sexual violence towards women. Now, I often have a lot of students say, yeah, okay, yeah, so we know that this happens in the media, like all the time, that women's bodies are really objectified. There's a lot of sort of reference directly or indirectly around women are just there to be consumed, mostly by men. Lots of references, either subtly or not so subtly, around sexual violence. Like, yeah, we all know this. But men are also sexually objectified, right? Men also, we see ads where you have, gorgeous men, shirtless oftentimes. And you're right. You're right. Men are also sexually objectified. But here's the thing, it happens to a far lesser degree. It does. Like, if you sort of did a tit for tat, sort of like count how many ads that show like male men being sexually objectified versus women, it is way less. And oftentimes it's used by marketers as a way to joke, right? For example, I think of the classic Old Spice guy, or even this salad dressing guy, where a part of it is that, yes, he's a sexy, gorgeous looking man, and therefore I really want to buy salad dressing, I guess. But, but part of it is also kind of the joke, right? Because it is a little bit funny to see men being objectified like women, right? The same sort of, very much the gender binary, the man box, whatever you want to say, of flipping the gender script, where men are sexually objectified. We kind of think it's a little bit funny. So it speaks to, again, that yes, men are objectified, but not as much as women, and oftentimes there's much different messages happening in this objectification. So why? Why in the society where, media consumers, particularly if we talk about television or even just, consumption itself, like buying goods and services and so forth, women are, steadily creeping up to be the majority. So why then do we still have these ads? These ads that can border on, all right, this is ridiculous, to incredibly offensive, to incredibly violent. Like there's some ads out there that, and they come out every year, which really degrade women or really sort of make um, alludes to violence against women. So why do we have this? Is it that our culture just you know accepts and wants objectification, or is it also because the people controlling media, the people like the advertisers, the people in the room deciding what ads they're going to be, the people behind the camera deciding what they're going to film, to the producers, to the studio heads, to the television network heads, aren't oftentimes reflective population wise to the people that they're serving. Meaning that there still remains an incredible discrepancy where you have mostly men dominating media, meaning those behind the camera, those in the board, those making the decisions of what we see and how we see it. And as this report goes, gender inequality, men dominate U.S. media still. Men receive 62% of credits in print, byline TV, wire news, movies, and films. Women receive 38%. So what this means is that it's not only that we need to have better representation in front of the camera, right? Have more depictions of women and also a variety of depictions of women, not just, a couple of stereotypes, but like let's show the full breadth of female characters and so forth. But also that behind the camera is incredibly unequal, where you have the media landscape still being very much dominated and controlled by men. And here's the thing, it's not that men are terrible because, they've been in these positions or that, they're by fault terrible. But when you want to talk about representation, if you don't have a seat at the table, meaning if you don't have a seat at the table making the decisions of what stories are we going to show, or what news we're going to report, or what, films are we going to produce, or what images are we going to use in this ad, if you don't have, a seat at the table in regards to representation, and representation not only of women, but also people of color, transgender persons, immigrants, just the whole sort of swath of diversity that there is in this country that's oftentimes not represented in the media, then you don't have those voices directing what we're going to see and how we consume it. So recently, Sweden added another rating system to its movie ratings. So, like the US, Sweden has the same sort of ratings. Like, there's R, there's G, there's PG 13, all these sort of ratings that help particularly parents, but just help the audience understand, what type of film this is, like how much violence is there, so forth. Well, they added another test called the Bechdel test to talk about gender representation. Now, the Bechdel test comes from actually as a joke, but with real meaning, by a female cartoonist named Alison Bechdel. And she wrote, and still continues to write, but she wrote the really famous comic strip called Dykes to Watch Out For, which she then talks about the Bechdel test and how to evaluate movies around gender representation. So Sweden adopted this, and then you see films that are like, they're rated R, but it also passes the Bechdel test or doesn't pass the Bechdel test. So what is the Bechdel test? Well, it's a really stupidly simple test. So let's go through it. Okay, there's 3 parts of the Bechdel test. So the first part, does the film have 2 female characters? And not talking about background characters or people just walking by or or a waitress who hands you a drink, but actually 2 characters that have names, right? Next, do then these female characters, and it has to be at least 2, talk to one another? So not talking to other people, but actually talk to one another. And then lastly, do they then talk to one another about something that is not about a man? And it could be anything from like how was the weather to like a major plot point, but it's not about a man. Now, On the onset, you can probably think, wow, that seems like a really simple, easy test that probably every film passes, right? You know, having two female women who then have to talk to each other, and they also have to talk to each other not about a man. But the truth is that the majority of films fail this. Because while it has gotten a little bit better around representation in regards to having just more female characters in major movies and TV shows, most of the time these female characters rarely speak to one another. Even if they're in the same room, they rarely speak to another. They're always speaking to, oftentimes, the other male characters. And then if these women do speak to one another, it's oftentimes about a man, usually the male protagonist, and not anything else from like how's the weather or a major plot point. And while this test seems incredibly simple and kind of silly, it does speak to representation in films because it's not just that there's a lot of films that fail right from the beginning where they don't even have two female characters. But even if they do, these female characters are usually in the service of the male characters, so therefore they don't really have any sort of breadth or any sort of motivation to talk to the other characters. And then, even if they do, even if these two female characters actually manage to talk to one another, oftentimes it is around the male protagonist. So, again, the whole story is centered around men. So, here's a couple films that failed the Bechdel test. And a lot of films do. I mean, the majority still do. Lord of the Rings fails the Bechdel test. Like, all of them fail the Bechdel test. You know, granted, that film has a lot of male characters and like three women. So, but I guess that tells you from the get go. Avatar fails the Bechdel test. Crazily enough, that the female characters don't actually talk to each other except about a man. Finding Nemo fails, which is sad because that's a really cute film. Toy Story 1 and 2 also fail. And then, this really breaks my heart, Harry Potter fails. You actually don't have female characters talking to one another about something that's not about a guy, usually Harry Potter. So what this tells you again, and again, you can take the Bechdel test for how you feel about it, if it's important or not, but it does speak to representation because it's something as silly as a film should have two female characters in it that talk to each other, not about a man, and that most films fail, speaks again to representation of women in film. I am happy to say, though, that Avengers Infinity War did pass the Bechdel test, so that makes me very, very, very pleased. So, this just sort of gets hard to what misrepresentation is all about and what part the first half of this assignment is about, which is around what you see and consume and how that impacts you, especially how the media teaches gender, especially how women are treated by the media, and then how that influences not only little girls and their own sense of identity and agency and how they grow up, but also little boys and their ideas around women's value and worth. So I really hope that you enjoy misrepresentation. I hope that you find some things interesting, and hopefully it does sort of make you think critically about the media. Again, this is not about shaming what you love to watch, but it is about we can be critical consumers and we can also ask for better representation.